literature.
Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to be talking you through the life of our man J.B. Priestley, the playwright of An Inspector Calls. Alright, so there's your man Priestley on the right, smoking a big fat cigar. He was born in 1894, John Boynton Priestley in Yorkshire. We're going to be talking about his life today. Throughout it, he wrote a number of politically charged works. By that, I mean plays that have a real political viewpoint, trying to put across his own political views. It wasn't just in Inspector Calls where he did that, he did it in a number of different plays. So I'm going to look at his life today and see what led him to do that. We're going to think of a few things. We're going to talk about his childhood. We're going to think about his time during the war, in fact 2 wars. We're going to talk about his relationships, his multiple relationships, his work and his politics. Let's move on. So first off, let's talk about J.B. Priestley's childhood growing up. And he grew up being called Jack. That was his nickname at school. He grew up in Bradford, West Riding in Yorkshire, the county of Yorkshire. Huge, huge county. And the city of Bradford, you can see there marked on the map for us. Bradford's famous for a number of things. One of the big things it was famous for at this stage was a booming textile mill trade. That's making cloth in different forms. At the bottom left on the photos there, you can see the outside of one of these mills. Huge, huge factories, enormous buildings that house many, many workers. At the top left there, you can see some children working. This would be a photo from before Priestley's time, before his age, but you can see some of the dangerous conditions that children were working in these mills. Now, by the time Priestley was growing up and writing, certainly safety in these factories had been hugely, hugely improved. And you didn't have anywhere near the working conditions, say, previous authors like Dickens had written about. But still big industrial factories with their dangers. In the middle, you can see some of the outskirts of Yorkshire, a beautiful, beautiful country with outstanding natural beauty. So you've got a contrast here between the urbanisation of the cities and the factories through the textile mill trade and the outstanding natural beauty of the area before the industrialisation. Now, J.B. Priestley's mother died when he was 2, but he continued to have a really good relationship with his stepmother after that point. So she came in very shortly after his mother died and really raised him as a child. And he always had a good relationship with her. So there was no drama in that period of childhood after his mother's death with his relationships afterwards. But no doubt quite a shocking moment in his childhood. He decided against going to university. Initially he decided not to do it. Instead he became a clerk in a local wool company. So all these textile mills were obviously producing a number of different cloths, wool being a big one. And he became a clerk, a bureaucracy man, an administrative assistant for the local wool company. He began at this point writing for local publications, but left when the war broke out. So he sort of dabbled in journalism, but when World War I broke out, he left to do other things, which we'll talk about in a second. With all of these different areas, I'm going to try and tell you what the links are that you can make. Well, first of all, let's have a think. Where's the links here with his childhood? Well, Mr. Burling was the owner of a textile factory, the type that Priestley would have grown around. So Priestley has first-hand knowledge of some of the businessmen in the areas where this was based. Bromley isn't a real place, it's not a real town, but we can guess it could be one of these northern towns, perhaps in Yorkshire or one of the surrounding counties. So a link there to kick us off with. Okay, so as you probably know, World War I happened in 1914 for 4 years until 1918. This was one of the most horrific events in human history, really one of the most brutal, tragic wars that has ever occurred. J.B. Priestley was right there throughout it. He was signed up to the British Army right at the start of World War I. He was sent to France to fight on the Western Front. Now, what does that mean? Well, there was 2 fronts, the Western Front and, as you can probably guess, the Eastern Front. He was on the Western Front. Now, both fronts had what was called trench warfare. J.B. Priestley would spend most of his days in a trench dug under the ground. You can see a picture there on the right with those lads stood in that trench. Now, in here you'd have terrible conditions. You'd be bombed with artillery, huge explosive shells blowing up around you, shaking the ground, literally blowing people out of the trenches around you. Terrible, terrible conditions. If you raised your head from the trench, You were likely to find snipers or machine guns from the enemy. Brutal conditions. On top of that, there was huge quantities of mud and standing water in the trenches, which people, because of, developed awful health conditions. One of them being trench feet, where people's legs, feet literally rotted away from being within this moisture, within the water for so long. J.B. Priestley was part of that. He was there. He received numerous injuries, some minor. Here we can talk about a little piece of flesh torn out of my thumb. He also received quite major injuries as well. Once when he was caught up in a gas attack, you can see a soldier there on the right in a gas mask, as well as the explosive shells. Both sides also bombed each other with gas, chlorine gas, mustard gas, in an effort to kill the enemy. Really horrible, nasty stuff that would burn the inside of your lungs. He was caught up in one of those gas attacks, needed treatment. He was eventually injured on a separate occasion, and his injuries were so severe that he was removed from frontline duty. So he was taken out of the front line of the trench. About this war, Priestley is incredibly articulate. He wrote, "I felt as the open wound, never to be healed, of my generation's fate, the best sorted out and then slaughtered, not by hard necessity, but by huge, murderous public folly." He sees this as an act of idiocy. He sees this war as stupidity. He cannot get over the number of friends, soldiers he's witnessed go to their deaths as a result of what he describes murderous public folly. Where are the links here? Well, war comes up a number of times. Mr. Burling says fiddlesticks and denies there will be a war. Remember, this play is set in 1912. He says that there is no chance that nobody wants war. The Germans don't want war, he says. And obviously the audience watching this in 1946 or later will know that 2 years after Burling fictionally said this, war was declared. On top of this, Burling suggests that they will all be having dinner, nice dinner together, in what would turn out eventually not to be World War I, but in the middle of World War II. And indeed, they would probably be likely to be under the Blitz, the German raids on British towns and cities, bombing raids that destroyed many areas. So Burling uses the war and uses dramatic irony here to make a point about Mr. Burling. So an experienced soldier within this war, Priestley talks about it and uses it within its spectacles. So we'll move on to a slightly lighter note and talk about Priestley's relationships. Priestley married Pat Tempest in 1921. Shortly afterwards, in 1923, they had their first child, Barbara. This was followed in 1924 by Sylvia, their second child, their second daughter. Now, very tragically, it was discovered that Pat, his wife, was suffering from terminal cancer just when Sylvia was being born. Of this, Priestley says, "I am in so deep in despair, I didn't know what to do with myself." Now, that reaction is understandable. Remember, his mother died when he was 2. This is the second time he's experiencing sincere loss. His reaction, though, is perhaps possibly less understandable and might be slightly confusing to us. Just after this diagnosis, he had a daughter, but not with Pat. He had a daughter, Mary, with a woman called Jane Widnan Lewis in March 1925. So clearly had an affair just a year after Sylvia was born, and just after Pat was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So something quite difficult for us to understand. Pat died in 1925 after Mary's birth, and he then ultimately married Jane and took his second wife. So a complex and difficult period in Priestley's life. He then married a third time, but had continued to have numerous affairs throughout his life, and he often said he found it difficult to resist the attraction of women. Why am I telling you this? Why is this important? Well, don't forget that relationships are an important theme in this play. Both Eric and Gerald have a relationship with Eva, and Gerald is having a relationship with Eva simultaneously with Sheila. And as a result, Sheila returns Gerald's engagement ring because of this relationship. So we can see certain links between the life of Priestley and some of the problems that are caused by relationships in his play and in Spectacles. So I'm not going to talk about all of J.B. Priestley's works, that would be ridiculous. However, I'm just going to rattle through and talk about some similarities with an Inspector Calls. He was a nonconformist writer, which was very popular around the period of time he was writing and the area he was writing in. They used both philosophy and science within their work. Many of his works follow similar themes to an Inspector Calls. A Dangerous Corner, for example, is where a family's secrets gradually get revealed throughout the play. His work began to focus more on social issues in An English Journey and after that point. So by social issues, I mean issues with society at the time, as we see in Inspector Calls, with the discrepancy between those with much wealth and those who are struggling to make ends meet. He was a popular speaker during World War II and he broadcast live on BBC Radio. In fact, he was so popular, he was the second most listened to person on that radio after Churchill, the Prime Minister. So hugely influential, hugely popular in his own time. Due to his achievements in literature, he was offered a lordship but refused it. He accepted instead the Order of Merit in 1977. Where are the links here? Well, many of his works follow a political theme of the inequalities of society, and he became a success for it, so much so that he was offered awards. Unlike his character, though, Mr. Burling, who chased a knighthood, demanded a knighthood, was very upset when he thought he wasn't going to get his knighthood, Priestley turned down an even more prestigious title to be in the House of Lords. So you can't talk about J.B. Priestley and not talk about his politics. His politics really began in World War II. Remember those radio broadcasts? He wanted a public discussion on what should happen to society in the United Kingdom after the war. Now there's a great quote here that sums this up. He said, "We are floundering between two stools. One, every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost, which can't really represent us. Or why should young men, for whom you and I have done little or nothing, tear up and down the sky in their Spitfires to protect us? The other, free men could combine, to see that each gives according to his ability and receives according to his need." What does this mean? Well, he says we've got two options. One, every man for himself. Everyone just looks after themselves, and if you get left behind, that's tough. That's the Mr. Burling approach. What he says, however, is that why are young men going to war and fighting for this country if that's a reality when they come back? What's the option? Well, he gives a second option. To see that each gives according to their ability and receives according to his need. So therefore, everyone works within the society, whatever their abilities, whatever their strengths, they give their most to society, and from that they receive what they need. Not everything, they're not greedy, they receive what they need, and that wealth is shared equally amongst those who need it the most. So an Inspector Calls really was born out of this wartime debate about how to create a better society. One thing to note, even though he was the second most popular speaker after Winston Churchill in the war, his broadcasts were actually cancelled for being too left-wing. So did this stop him and stop him talking about politics? Absolutely not. He was more than happy to be called a socialist and supported what he described as a more moral politics. In 1942, he and others formed the Commonwealth Party. It was a political party, a left-wing socialist political party. His party's ideas were that wealth should be shared more evenly and based on need. Think back to that quote we just read. Hence why it was called the Commonwealth Party. Wealth should be supported by everybody and shared amongst everybody. Commonwealth, wealth for everybody. Now, where are the links to the play with this? Well, Inspector Gould essentially is Priestley. Inspector Gould is a socialist and spends the play pointing out the problems of capitalism. Burling is a committed capitalist, and Priestley uses the play to make him and his views look stupid. Think back to all that dramatic irony with the Titanic being unsinkable, war will never happen. He makes Priestley and his family's views look stupid. The Inspector comes out of this very well. The Inspector pretty much really is the political voice of Priestley. He voices all the political views that Priestley voiced himself in amongst society. So let's have a quick recap of the links between the play and J.B. Priestley's life. Mr. Burling owned a textile business. Priestley's hometown of Bradford was the centre of this trade. Priestley fought and was wounded in World War I. He was a broadcast reporter in World War II, and he uses the war, to make Mr. Burling look stupid when he assures the audience and his family there will be no war. 2 years later, we know World War I was declared. Like Gerald, Priestley found it difficult to be faithful to the woman he was with, had numerous affairs. Many of Priestley's work follow similar themes of class inequality. And finally, Priestley channeled his political views through Inspector Gould. Priestley became very, very famous for his writings and his politics. We can see his statue there in his hometown of Bradford. As we read, and as you read in Spectacles, don't forget to link Priestley's own life to these events and see what you think Priestley was trying to say with the actions he makes his characters describe. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure you watch the rest of the Inspector Calls series.